The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the reception hall as I sat in exile at table 12, far enough from the bridal party to be forgotten, close enough to the speakers that conversation was impossible. My sister Aubrey had orchestrated the seating arrangement with surgical precision, ensuring I'd remain exactly where I'd always been in our family, invisible. I smoothed the beige dress she'd specifically requested I wear, something muted, Sabrina, nothing that draws attention, and watched her glide through the crowd like a swan in silk. Every gesture was calculated, every smile perfectly timed. She'd always been the golden child, the one who collected achievements like trophies and displayed them for maximum effect. The misspelled place card in front of me read Sabina, but I'd stopped correcting these oversights years ago. What was the point? To my family, I was the sister who did things online, a vague, dismissive phrase that covered everything they couldn't be bothered to understand. My mother had introduced me at last year's Thanksgiving as between jobs, despite the fact that I'd just finished securing $12 million in funding for a green tech startup. I'd smiled and passed the cranberry sauce, swallowing the correction along with my pride. There's only so many times you can explain your worth before you realize they don't want to hear it. Then he walked in. Cale Donnelly commanded attention the moment he entered the reception hall. The Forbes 30 Under 30 CEO moved like he expected the world to rearrange itself around him, and it did. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned. Even the string quartet seemed to play with more enthusiasm. He wore his success like a tailored navy suit, effortless, expensive, impossible to ignore, no tie, perfectly tousled hair, the kind of calculated casualness that screamed I'm too important to try too hard. The very air seemed to vibrate with his presence. My mother practically levitated from her seat, waving him over with both hands. Cale, over here, sweetheart. Her voice carried the breathless quality reserved for celebrities and lottery winners. I watched the performance unfold with fascination. My father stood straighter, adjusting his tie nervously. My uncle smoothed his jacket like he was preparing for a job interview. Even Cameron, the groom, seemed to shrink in comparison. Cale glided toward our table with practiced grace, dispensing firm handshakes and that million-dollar smile. He embraced Aubrey with the familiarity of someone who'd helped build her career, whispering something that made her laugh like silver bells. Impressive crowd, Aubrey, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people lean in. You've outdone yourself. I was standing less than 3 feet away. His gaze swept past me with the efficiency of a security scanner, registering my presence only long enough to dismiss it. Not even polite confusion, just practiced, reflexive indifference. To him, I was furniture, background noise, the kind of person whose name you never bother to learn. The familiar sting of invisibility hit harder than I'd expected. I'd prepared for this moment, but feeling it was different. I was just another face in Aubrey's supporting cast, someone not worth acknowledging. But here's what Cale Donnelly didn't know. I'd been watching his company for months. I'd dissected their quarterly reports, analyzed their user retention data, tracked their disastrous Latin American expansion that had cost them millions. I'd written the memo that convinced Carradine Capital to pass on their Series B round, a recommendation that had probably cost his company the validation they desperately needed. He'd never seen my name on that report, but he'd felt its impact, the weight of doors that didn't open, investors who wouldn't return calls, the slow erosion of confidence that comes when smart money says not yet. I turned my champagne glass slowly, feeling the condensation slip between my fingers. My heart was beating faster, but my breathing remained steady. This was a moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire life. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. My aunt gushed about Aubrey's college achievements. My mother added commentary about her natural leadership abilities, the familiar symphony of praise that had soundtracked my childhood. I could have stayed silent, should have, probably, let him enjoy his moment at the top of our family's social pyramid, but I was tired, not angry, just exhausted by the weight of being unseen. So I stood. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable above the music and laughter, but I walked directly to where he stood, not with force or drama, just quiet certainty, the kind of presence that makes people turn without understanding why. He didn't notice me until I was close enough to speak softly, my voice carrying just far enough to reach his ear. Your platform's bleeding users faster than you can acquire them, I said, my tone conversational. Series C is going to be challenging. The words landed like a blade wrapped in silk. Cale's champagne glass tilted, a single drop of Dom Perignon hitting the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. For the first time all evening, he looked at me, really looked, his brain scrambling to process what he'd just heard. Aubrey, he said slowly, his voice tighter than before. Who is this? My sister's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, embarrassment, something that might have been panic. This is my sister, Sabrina. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. I watched his expression shift, pieces clicking into place with almost audible precision. Sabrina Hollis, he repeated, the name carrying weight now. That's right, I said, offering the smallest of smiles. We've never been formally introduced, but I believe your board is familiar with my work. The crowd around us had begun to sense something significant happening. Conversations quieted, heads turned. Even the string quartet seemed to play more softly, as if the music itself was holding its breath. You work with Carradine Capital, he said, not a question, a realization. Among others, I confirmed. I've been following your company's trajectory with interest. Carradine wasn't just any venture capital firm, they were the quiet kingmakers, the ones who'd backed 3 of the last decade's biggest tech success stories. My role as their strategic advisor wasn't public knowledge, but behind closed doors, my analysis shaped decisions that could make or break companies exactly like his. Aubrey's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Why didn't you ever tell me you worked in tech? The words came out sharper than she'd intended, years of assumptions cracking under the weight of new information. I turned to her, keeping my voice level. You never asked. It wasn't petty, it was simply true. My sister had spent so many years categorizing me as the one who never quite made it that she'd stopped listening long before I had anything worth hearing. Behind us, a small crowd had gathered, pretending to admire the floral arrangements while obviously eavesdropping. I could feel their attention like heat from a fire, warming and dangerous. I remember your review, Cale said finally. It was thorough. It was accurate, I replied. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, it was. The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. This was the moment where everything shifted, not just for him, but for everyone watching. The invisible sister had just demonstrated that she'd been anything but powerless. Aubrey's perfect composure finally cracked. Are you seriously discussing business at my wedding? She hissed. Cale turned to her, his expression softening but his voice still carrying that new note of respect. Aubrey, your sister is. He paused, searching for the right words. She's someone I should have recognized much sooner. I didn't need to hear the rest. The point had been made with surgical precision. As I turned to leave, Cale reached into his jacket. May I? He asked, extending a business card. I accepted it without looking. I'll consider it. He nodded, understanding that this was as much acknowledgement as he was going to get. I'd appreciate that. As I walked back to table 12, I caught my mother's eye. Her expression was a complex mixture of confusion and recalculation, the look of someone whose entire understanding of a situation had just been rewritten. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche. People who'd ignored me for hours suddenly found reasons to stop by my table. The groomsmen who'd barely acknowledged me earlier appeared with a suddenly interested smile. Cousins who'd dismissed me as still figuring things out approached with syrupy voices full of newfound respect. Even my Aunt Denise, who'd once offered to help me find a real job, cornered me near the dessert table with an apologetic tone. You've always been so private about your work. We didn't realize. I gave her a kind smile. That's all right. I wasn't asking to be realized. But it was my mother's reaction that spoke volumes. She didn't approach me directly, that would have required admitting she'd been wrong. And my mother had never been good at apologies. Instead, she sent signals. The narrowed eyes, the whispered conversations with relatives, the way she tilted her chin toward me while talking to Aunt Trudy. I knew that look. I'd become useful, and that was the only kind of interesting my mother had ever respected. Aubrey found me later, somewhere between the father-daughter dance and the cake cutting. Her makeup was still flawless, but her smile had lost its earlier warmth. Can we talk? She asked. We stepped onto a balcony strung with fairy lights. The sounds of celebration muffled behind us. For a moment, it felt like we were teenagers again, sneaking out to breathe when the house got too loud. You made a scene, she said without preamble. I spoke 7 words, I replied. You humiliated me in front of my boss. I leaned against the railing, choosing my words carefully. No, I reminded him I exist. That's not the same thing. Aubrey crossed her arms defensively. You should have told me what you really do. I tried. Years ago. You weren't interested. The silence between us was thick with decades of misunderstanding. Finally, she asked, why didn't you ever fight for space? You let us treat you like background, and now you want credit for being center stage? I turned to face her fully. I don't want center stage. I never did. But I won't apologize for refusing to be small enough to ignore anymore. She didn't respond immediately. That silence between sisters is a familiar thing, thicker than anger, deeper than resentment. It's the space where all the unsaid things live. I'm happy for you, Aubrey, I said finally. I mean that. You looked beautiful tonight, and you deserve to be celebrated. Her shoulders softened slightly. I didn't mean to make you feel. You didn't need to mean it. I interrupted gently. You just did it. She blinked, then nodded. Are you happy, Sabrina? The question surprised me. I took my time answering. I'm at peace, I said. I built a life I don't have to prove to anyone. That's more than happiness. When I returned to the reception, the cake had been cut and people were dancing. A few guests smiled at me as I passed, but I didn't linger. Cale caught my eye from across the room and lifted his glass in a toast that was equal parts respect and acknowledgement. I didn't return the gesture. I had nothing left to prove. I gathered my clutch and stepped outside to call for a car. The night air was crisp, clearing my head of champagne and complicated emotions. As I waited at the curb, I glanced at the wedding invitation still tucked inside my purse, cream cardstock, embossed names, elegant and expected. I didn't belong in that world, but I didn't need to. Because sometimes reclaiming your place isn't about crashing the party, it's about reminding them you were on the guest list all along. There's a strange kind of power in silence when it's chosen rather than forced. For years, I'd let people fill in the blanks about who I was. I'd let them call me quiet, aimless, forgettable. I'd let them skip over my name in introductions and forget my accomplishments while celebrating Aubrey's every minor promotion. And I'd stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew I only needed one moment, one perfectly timed sentence delivered with precision, to remind them who I really was. That night at the wedding, I didn't just reclaim my place, I reminded them I'd never left. The version of me they'd ignored was never the real one. I'd grown beyond their definitions, and I no longer needed their permission to exist. Cale would remember me, so would Aubrey, so would everyone who witnessed the moment when champagne nearly slipped from trembling fingers. But I wouldn't carry any of them with me, not as burdens, not as validation, not as goals, because when you've built your own foundation, you don't owe anyone a blueprint. Just presence, quiet certainty, a name they'll Google when the room clears. And sometimes, that's all it takes.